and I'm of course here with Daniel Braum. And Daniel, thanks so much for jumping aboard this crazy train known as Dark Bites, so we can chat about your book right behind me here called Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales. That's fresh out from Cemetery Dance. Um, we had a chance to talk about it when we met at the author convention last 2 months ago now in Richmond, Virginia. And I just want to again thank you for having the foresight to publish this on my birthday, May the 19th.
Oh
Really
wow!
appreciate that. Thanks, man.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's really great to be here. I guess thank you to Cemetery Dance and Kevin Lucia
Yeah.
for the inadvertent birthday present. Happy birthday! Happy belated birthday, and
Thank you. Thank you.
happy sharing a book birthday with the book. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should probably warn you and everybody watching this as well. Obviously, nobody knows what time it is. This gets posted when it gets posted, but normally, so we're chatting a little bit later in the nighttime than what I'm accustomed to. So I'll generally do these chats, kind of in the morning or in the later in the afternoon. So just a heads up, instead of getting coffee, Rick, you're getting whiskey, Rick. So things might get a little bit silly here. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I think we should be okay though.
All right, I'm feeling psyched. I'm psyched. Whiskey, I'm on the whiskey side of the podcast, and pleased to be here.
Excellent. I know, right? It's like Jekyll and Hyde. Look out, everyone. So as much as I enjoyed the stories that you've got in the Night Marchers, and I think you had about, I want to say 12 stories, 13 stories altogether in this one.
I'd have to check. That sounds about right. But yeah, like cool. Math, that falls into the math side of things. Even basic math hurts us writer types.
You got it right, yeah. And goddamn those people that have that kind of work from the left and the right side of the brain to just to rub it all in here to both sides of the fence. But I'm definitely on the word side of the fence too. I was the kid in the back of the math class writing little poems and things to impress.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
so.
I'm the kid in the outfield that forgot to change sides and was thinking about Dungeons and Dragons or something. So I'm right there with you.
Perfect. So, however many stories there are in here, I'm always a sucker for origin stories, especially when it comes to putting collections together. So I want to ask, because I know even some of the stories, such as Night Marchers itself, which is unique to this story. To this collection, rather. I think you wrote that one back and correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am. Whiskey, that's my excuse for anything I get wrong here. I think you actually wrote that one in 2015, if I remember correctly, or was that Sphinx Moon?
I think the Night Marchers was the title story was first published in the Cemetery Dance ebook back in 2016. So that was first published then, and the night. Although the Night Marchers was written, if I'm not mistaken, it was in the 2000s, so sometime maybe around 2006, 2007, 2008. Yeah, it was the Sphinx of Cropsey Avenue, the last one in the book that was original to the collection that came out with the original Cemetery Dance ebook in there. If my memory, you have whiskey, I have no excuse.
Oh no, okay. I can pause for a little bit of whiskey identification if needed. So, no, that's awesome, and that's what I love about this too, Dan, is that a lot of the stories kind of, and I love the fact that at the end of all these amazing stories, you actually have some author notes talking about the origin of the stories, and you list those origin stories in the order that they were written in. So I want to ask about the ultimate origin story, which is, when did the concept for writing this collection first come to you, and when did you first started sitting down and actually editing through them all, putting those stories together? Can you maybe walk us through a little bit of what that looked like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it gives me a chance to express my gratitude to the acquiring editor of the book. And the credit to that has to go to Norman Prentice. He's the editor emeritus of Cemetery Dance ebooks. He was head of the ebook line, and an editor at Cemetery Dance magazine for quite some time. Mm-hmm. So I'm embarrassed to say that Norman envisioned this book before I envisioned it, before I had any concept of it.
Oh, wow.
I'm really fortunate that Norman, who had acquired and edited some of my stories for Cemetery Dance magazine, he had asked me to do this collection for the ebook line, and it took me a while to say yes, because I just didn't. As a reader, I didn't. While I was very much into short stories, I just didn't quite grasp the concept of a collection, and I didn't view. I didn't view myself as having a collection, and I didn't really quite understand where my work at that time was fitting into horror. And I really credit to Norman, all the Norman and Cemetery Dance for all those things. Once I said yes to Cemetery Dance and said yes to Norman, I said, well, how do I do that? What do I do? I'd been writing for quite some time. I had a large amount of stories to choose from. It was clear that the heart of the book, the first 3 stories in the book, were going to be the 3 stories that had been published in Cemetery Dance magazine, which were Across the Darien Gap, Jellyfish Moon, and The Green Man of Punta Cabre. And then I went through the process of evaluating the stories as to what Norman and I thought would be the most horror-based of my stories. Yeah. And the reason I say that is when I sit down to write, I don't have genre in mind, and more so in that it took me a while to figure out that what I was writing is what people call horror. So I had my very rudimentary, or just my understandings of what my perception would be the closest to a Cemetery Dance story was, and I started assembling a list. So to be really rudimentary about it, like I have some stories that have horror elements in them, but they maybe also were in space, or they had a rocket ship in them. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's more towards science fiction. Let's rule that out for this book. Or maybe there's a story that has this element or that element. So I tried to view my stories as close to horror as possible. Okay. Now that you've read the book, you understand that yes. They still are pretty interstitial. They're still pretty on the borderlands. But again, a lot of gratitude for Cemetery Dance and for horror for having me under that umbrella.
Very cool. And I love that you do mention that as well, that the fact that you kind of write on the borderlands of it, because that's definitely came across very, very clearly to me as I was reading these stories, is that you do tend to write on the fringe of horror, where certainly there's some horror elements in there, but that's not it doesn't come across like that's your ultimate intention when you set out to write these stories. If I can steal something from John Urbansick, who I believe you know as well, he was at the AuthorCon too. He's always stated that he writes more. He compares himself to Brian Keene, who of course is host of AuthorCon for those listening. And I've been under a rock. I don't know who Brian Keene is. Go check him out. But however, as good friends, John often makes the comparison that Brian Keene writes with the intention to terrify people, whereas John, and I think very much your work fits under what the category perhaps of quiet horror, that it's more written to make people wonder, to give people a sense of wonder. Do you think that's a fair assessment of your overall approach to your stories?
Yeah, it's a really great. That's really fair. I don't think I can't say I know what, if I'm thinking about the audience when I'm writing it, but I like that you mentioned the sense of wonder in there, because I feel like awe and dread are kissing cousins. They're really close by, and especially in quiet horror, in weird fiction, in strange horror, in the unexplainable, which are subjects that I tend to and other authors tend to go by. Yeah, that sense of awe is right next to that sense of fear and fear of the unknown. And a lot of stories in the Night Marchers, well, they definitely veer into the unexplained, but they do travel into the fear and what's uncomfortable, but also there is that sense of wonder in that experience. And intentional or not, I really like that in fiction that I read, and I like that perhaps in some of the stories that comes across to readers as well.
Yeah, well, it definitely came across to me, and I love the fact that you mentioned that as well. That that sort of straddling the line between awe and dread. Because I find it really funny because I'll admit that I mean it's hard to pick a couple of favorites. Probably maybe even harder for you. I'm not sure. And I do want to ask you what your favorite is a little bit later, but I found that my two favorite stories out of this book are out of this collection are so different. I loved Spark.
Ah,
What a gut wrenching, in a sense, horrific story for those listening. Not to give any spoilers away, but it's essentially a man who deals with the grief of a lost child and finds that in dealing with his grief, it's like he comes so close to what her death was all about to the point of perhaps getting a little bit too close to what the definition of her death was. And I thought it's probably a terrible description.
oh, not at all, not at all. I mean, everyone's. That's a beauty. That's a beauty of talking about fiction is, and especially the kind of fiction that I like. So I love it that everyone can see their own thing in there, even though what I think what you said is a fair spoiler-free synopsis of the story. So yeah, I really love to hear it.
Cool, thank you. And it's interesting because I know that on the flip side of that, my other favorite story that I had in there, and my brain just ran off with the trains as to which one it was. It was the one regarding the two folks that are out in the desert.
That's The Moon and the Mesa.
Yes, The Moon and the Mesa. Thank you. I know I should be fresh in my memory here. So The Moon and the Mesa, which was super interesting because I felt it was such an ambiguous story, but it was so beautiful. It just captures you. They can't help but wonder what's going to happen. And it had such a shadow of awe that was kind of over it all, where you weren't sure where it was going, but you knew that there was something mysterious under everything that you were kind of writing. Do you find, like, when you're writing your stories and you set out to write a story, Dan, like, do you find that that's something that you always have in mind, that you kind of want to keep that ambiguity at the forefront of what you do, which I know sounds like a bit of an oxymoron, or is it something you find you read it and then you're like, oh, huh, yeah, I guess it's not very clear what the story's about until you've read the story as a whole?
No, I think certainly now I like to keep that ambiguity in the forefront. I write, I at least classify now that I'm more versed in horror, in genres and labels. Like the book says, and other strange tales, I call what I write strange tales in the lineage of an author, Robert Aikman, who also called his stories strange tales. Yeah. And I like to use the term intentional ambiguity. And I'm glad that you mentioned those two stories, especially Spark, because a lot of what I like as a reader is when a story could have at least two definitions, two theories of what's happening. Not ambiguous and confusing, ambiguous and unclear are not should not be used interchangeably. Like in Spark, you focused on the psychological side, that this is a story about grief. This is a story about what this man might be doing out of a psychological reaction to trauma. On the other side of it has to do with fire, and there very well might be something supernatural about that fire. Is it one or the other? Both of us can have a wonderful discussion till the cows come home about which is which. So I like stories that have this tension, this play between the psychological and the supernatural. So I do, at least now, I like to keep that in the forefront. I think decades ago when I first started out, I was doing it instinctually.
Okay, very cool. And speaking of that too, like a lot of the stories I find too really tend to deal with the characters tend to go on a journey. I mean, most of the stories, I think, and correct me again if I'm wrong, are about 5,000 words or so. So you don't really have a lot of time to build a huge character arc, yet you seem to pull it off anyways. So it seems like every character is just the character you start off with. They're not quite the characters at the end of it. Either they're further away from understanding who they truly are, or they're closer to understanding who they truly are. And it seems like, analyzing that personal identity and where they fit in the world and, the broader universe is important to a lot of your characters. And I find, as one of the blurbs eloquently talked about, is that a lot of your stories seem to be dangerously personal. Is that something that you find that you explore a lot in your own personal life? Is that something that, again, back to intention, that you intentionally put into season your stories with? Or is that just something that, because it is so dangerously personal, you have no choice but to write about identity and the exploration of that in the world and the world around us?
Well, I certainly want the stories, dodging the question as to whether any story or not is personal, at least for the time being.
Sure.
I really like what you said there. I want to have the verisimilitude. I want to have in the story, I want to have the feeling of reality. I want to have the feeling that these characters are real, that these characters have something at stake, and that these characters, may be closer or farther away from some sort of understanding in the end. And I think that is a common, I'm really glad you pointed that out, that is a common thing between all these stories take place in all different places around the globe, different characters, different protagonists, male, female, from different places in life. But the one thing that the stories do have is that the supernatural is a catalyst to the human. Whether these aren't stories about, you won't find vampires or named monsters that you can say, hey, and there's nothing wrong with those stories because I love those kind.
Oh yeah.
But in these stories, it's not like there's a vampire and we have to stake it and then we have to, bury the coffin. The rules of the supernatural are often unclear or unexplained, and the encounters, instead of defeating or overcoming the supernatural, like most horror stories have, we don't have that in here. It's about the ramifications to these people's personal journeys and whatever's at stake for them at the moment. That it's as close to any formula that you'll find in the Night Marchers. And they are personal. They are personal stakes, even if they aren't something that's personal to me that I've experienced. It is something that hopefully, you can recognize it. Like in Spark, you can be like, this is about grief, and this is about trauma to a father and a lost child. In the other one, in The Moon and the Mesa, it's about generational trauma, and it's about revenge or retribution or mercy, and these are things that matter to everyone, I hope.
No, absolutely. And certainly your story too regarding, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, the story regarding the Crazy Horse, the resurrection of Crazy Horse, essentially, where you do kind of drive home the importance as well of sort of a salvage past, where everybody has a past, but not everybody wishes to salvage that. And it's interesting, you have these characters that kind of go back and they try to, in a sense, preserve their history by, avenging, I guess, the evolution of their history or the stealing of their history in a sense. So I find some of those tropes for really, really interesting that you put in those stories.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that story was called The Ghost Dance, and
yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's would be the closest to reality that maybe we've got. I mean, the Ghost Dance was a Native American political and spiritual movement in reaction to the way Native Americans had been treated by our countries. But heritage, autonomy, the feelings that people have behind that are things that I think people feel, even if it's specific to one culture or one person.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's a really, really good way of putting that. And speaking of, for the way that your stories get formulated, one of the questions that I was really curious and excited to ask you about is I guess really the closest thing to asking an author of where they get their ideas from is kind of maybe how their perspective is wired. And I always wondered, with reading the stories that you've got laid out in this collection of Night Marchers, is I always wondered if maybe the way that you looked at some of these locales and looked at some of these situations that you put the characters through, and perhaps the way that you look at the world, Dan, do you find that you look at the world very much the same way as a lot of these characters, and that perhaps you look at the world as, having those supernatural elements, having those magical aspects to it more as a defense for maybe the reality of what really is? Or do you find that you kind of look at the world in sort of a wondrous way, because you might look down an alley and some of us might see a serial killer waiting for us in the shadows, but maybe you're looking down that alley and you're picturing some magical dimensional state of a doorway or something down there? What do you find that's like, how do you travel the world, I suppose, as it relates to how you view your stories and tell them?
Oh, I like that question. I think it really, it's around the world of horror inspiration. I can't help but mention, Rick, you and I met in connection. There was a wonderful panel at the Scares That Care Author Con. It was a psychological horror panel.
Right.
I think you asked a really great question. And yeah, a lot of horror authors, I learned, do have the cathartic approach.
Mm-hmm.
At least I'm not consciously doing that. My approach, I think, maybe veers more towards the other half of what you said, of more of the daydreaming and the imaginative. Often my inspiration, or the part that I can't put my finger on, the part that comes as closest to the magic, it comes from setting. Like, often something about a setting, either someplace that I've been or someplace that I'm daydreaming or yearning about, I'll feel like the stories come from the setting first. It's a sense of place. It's some small detail or something that comes first. And then the characters come after. That becomes a more inorganic part of my process. Once I'm, say, I'm going to be writing about a place, I'll think about the characters. I'll think about what stories can only be told in that place, and who are the characters to tell it, and what's at stake personally, internally, as well as externally for them. And that's my launching point for a lot of how my stories start.
Wow, very cool. I gotta say, I wasn't expecting that answer. That's awesome. That's some super cool insight.
All right, listen, I want to say, don't try this at home. I mean, I'm kind of laughing. I think it's really important, if there are any new writers or people beginning to write, to the importance of doing it your way. Look, it's also important to learn how all your favorite writers or the teachers do it, but don't get caught up in the tyranny of how to write. I mean, even the best writers, Stephen King, he's got his methods. And yeah, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're not a writer. Okay, according to On Writing, I'm not a writer. I jest, but yeah, it's great to listen to other authors and even try their methods on for size, but never rule your own method out, even if it isn't the way everyone else is doing it. It's okay to do it and have camaraderie and to have kinship with the way other people do it. And it's also okay to just experience the world and experience the way you're writing, the way you do it as well. And so I want to make sure that that gets put out there.
Great. No, that's fantastic information. And thank you very much for saying that. I think that's a golden nugget that everybody should be sinking their teeth into as well, because sure, it's great to have maybe start off as a with the fandom approach, where you just want to do what your heroes are doing, but at the same time, I think you really got to find your own way. Otherwise, you're writing to represent your heroes rather than writing to represent what the stories that you have to tell, not that other people have to tell. So I think that's super important to get across.
Yeah. I don't think there are wrong ways. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with. In fact, it's probably good advice to stay on the path, to learn how to diverge from the path. That there's nothing wrong with that. That might even be good advice.
Sure.
If it's not good advice for you, that's good too.
Exactly. No, I know most of the folks, most of the authors that I talk to, I know myself included, when I set out to write a short story, I definitely don't do any kind of outlines, but the fact that all of your stories from beginning to end, they come so full circle that it really gives you the impression that you truly have gone on a journey with these characters, do you tend to outline your short stories as well, Dan, where this is where I'm starting, this is my setting, this is where I need to get them to, and then it's just a matter of kind of fleshing out the details as you go along, or do you just completely go, this is my setting, let's see what happens, go?
Well, I've done it both ways.
Okay.
Where I'm at now, even if I don't do an outline per se, before I put pen to paper, finger to keyboard, I like to know in my own mind. I like to know the story. So I don't like to figure it out on the page. I like to, even if I don't outline it, I like to tell myself or tell a friend or a colleague the story over and over and over again. I like to know that story before I write it. At least now. I've done it the other way as well. It's exciting to figure things out on the page as well. But where I'm at now, I'd like to know the story well enough that I can focus on the craft of writing and getting that intention, getting the story that I've told or that I've told myself or that I know, then getting the task of, okay, how does it exist now on the page, on that medium, getting it across there.
Very cool. And speaking of mediums too, thanks for the segue, is I noticed that a lot of there's some very I guess similar mediums, if you will, or I guess jumping off points for a lot of the stories throughout this collection that almost seem to come across like a bit of a connective tissue. I love the fact too. I see your awesome aquarium behind you and the fish floating around in there. So there seem to be a lot of stories that had to do with some sort of water, whether it's fishing or diving, and music certainly played a part through some of your stories as well. Some of them it was kind of background to the point where you have to kind of digest it to think, okay, what is the meaning of this? And other ones where you really put the music kind of at the as a main character in a sense. Is that something that you, again, back to intentionality, is that something you kind of did intentionally, or is that just something that you find that is always there kind of influencing you and kind of the worm that's constantly wiggling around in your ear as far as, exotic locales of islands, water, music?
I sure wish I could say that was intentional and be like, yes, thank you for noticing that stroke that I worked. Yeah, that's those are things that unintentionally creep in there where you can't really put a finger on.
Sure.
Inspiration. So the connective tissues, the majority of them were not intentional. I'm glad you mentioned the fish, because I think I promised I was going to tell you a story. You mentioned the story about the ghost fish. The story's called Mystic Tryst, and it came out about a decade and a half ago. And it is a story about a relationship between a couple, a recently divorced couple, and the ghosts of their pet fish, and what happens to their relationship in how they're dealing with these pet fish. And look, just the humorous anecdote that I wanted to say about that, after I wrote that, I felt really good about the story, because I'm like, wow, what an original thing. I don't know if anyone's written about ghost fish before. I was so proud of myself, which is not really a good thing to be, right?
You ego.
Yeah, you never want to have ego about these things. But I did, sometimes you feel better about stories than others. And this was one that I thought was really original. And I kept getting great feedback from editors, but the editors were all saying something that really perplexed me. They were like, yeah, we're seeing way too many of ghost fish stories out there. And I was like, what? Like, I was just so surprised. Like, how can such a thing be? Until I realized one of my favorite authors, and someone who I dare say might be the best of us, Karen Russell. Karen Russell had recently published a story, I believe, in the New Yorker that had ghost fish, and wow, I forgot the name of it right now, but what an amazing story. It's in her collection, St. Lucy's Home, for girls who were raised by wolves, and I highly recommend that collection and the story. And it's just great. It's a humbling laugh to be like, yeah, where you think you're doing something original, like, yeah, someone's been there before. But no, I'm a believer in that there are no original stories. It's just the way we tell them. And our stories are very different. But yeah, it was just a funny ghost fish anecdote. I promised I would tell you.
That's hilarious. No, I appreciate that. That's so funny because honestly, I'm reading the story and the entire time I was thinking like WTF and also thinking this story shouldn't work. It's about ghost stories that basically put a wedge between the separation of this couple that they're almost like fire and water together where they're so dynamic with each other, but they're clearly better off without each other. And these damn fish that pull them that keep pulling them together. It's like, the whole, just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. And I'm reading this thing and I'm like, they're ghost fish. This shouldn't work. And the fact that this is actually a pretty common theme in stories, I think is freaking hilarious.
Or at least at that moment in time, when there was someone else had put the zeitgeist out there, and apparently I don't know why it was at that moment in time, but I love I love that experience that you said, like WTF. I love reading a story, being on unsteady ground with it, and also to be like where's this going? This shouldn't be going there. I don't get it. And the few times that I do get the feedback, this shouldn't work. There's something delightful about that. I guess it's delightful that it gave that kind of experience to a reader, and it is gratifying that I want the stories to work. I do want the stories to work, and I've been told. I don't really focus on the negative, but I had been told many times before in situations where I shouldn't have. No, you can't do this, and this is wrong. And so I'm glad that I came over that in my writer's journey, and I also want to put it out there that hey, it's subjective. Yeah, if it could work for you and not work for someone else. Like I happen to be a big fan of the Lord of the Rings of Tolkien, and to me it's great. And to some other people, it's like, what the F?
Yeah,
it doesn't work for me. I don't get it. Now I know that's kind of obvious to say, but especially for those of us who do work in the borderlands, maybe it's a little bit more important to keep an eye on that ball too.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that sometimes there's people that are maybe a little bit snobbish about their fanfare when it comes to horror, which as long as they're part of our community, that's a good thing. But I think
not even snobbish. It could be. Some of these things that were said to me, I think, were sometimes it could be even benevolent. In the case of just sometimes teachers or people who are so well versed in their craft that they only know one way, and they've forgotten other things, and even a well-intentioned benevolent thing can become tyrannical to the creative mind.
So that's actually a really good way of putting that. So it's and I think I would definitely agree with that, because I mean, I don't know. I think the one thing that I've always loved about horror is it kind of causes us to wonder. I think as a default, it does give us that sense of wonder. It's just from the sensation of fear, where you wonder what's really in that closet, what's really under your bed, what's its intention really going to be? Am I really in danger, kind of thing? And I think that's certainly where writing on the fringes of that particular genre of that straight ahead horror works really well for folks like you that are writing that quiet horror, that you give us that sense of wonder, almost like there's almost a childlike innocence to that. And I think it's fantastic that we don't lose that childlike innocence, that we still wonder what's under the bed, what's in that alley, because sure, it might be something that's wanting to kill us and cut us up and have its way with us, but it could also be something really beautiful, that the discovery of that beauty in itself could be kind of a scary transition. And I love the fact that you tend to explore that really well in your stories.
Well, thank you. Yeah, or even both of them are going side by side.
Sure.
And look, I love stories. I love stories that play with expectations. I love stories that appear to be one thing, but maybe in closer inspection turn out to be something else. Talking about film for a second, I think a film that does that really well is the film It Follows. It appears to be a film you've seen 100 times before. Teens in peril, teens being stalked, teens versus the monster. And in one way, it is that story. But peeling those layers off, not very far. It also becomes a strange tale or weird horror very fast. And while it's two things at once, it's still that horror story that you know and you love, yet it's also about something else. And I think that's it's a hard nut to crack, but it's really delightful. And to me, it's exciting. I love the first position. Look, I love my horror, but like when that horror does something else as well, I start to get really happy and excited about it. And I hope I hope that's what, if my stories can do that sometimes for people, then I'm really happy as well.
Good. Well, you have every right to be happy about that, because I think, and you know, It Follows, I think, is great. I mean, it definitely ties in sort of, just a really regret for not just making a bad decision and, going to the basement to see what just made that noise. You're going to regret that decision, but it's also, really analyzes the regret of self as well, and saying, wow, I'm kind of a shitty person, and this is the consequence of making that bad decision about, the path that I'm on, kind of thing. And I think that, that's something that kind of transcends horror. I think that's something that's really relatable, and which again ties back in a lot of your stories, Dan, is that you really make a lot of these stories relatable, no matter how much of a supernatural element that they have in there. And I think that's a really tough act to pull off. And
thank you.
You nailed it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And how are we doing for time, by the way, Dan? Are we okay for a couple of more quick
questions?
Well,
let's keep going. Thanks for asking. I appreciate it. I've got my Gatorade Zero, and
nice.
I'm still upright. How's that whiskey treating you? You still doing okay there?
My cup is still wet at the bottom, so we're okay to keep going.
All right, so cheers. Let's do it. Let's keep going.
All right. Is that the white Zero?
Yeah, white Zero. And I love one of the great mysteries in life, I think you've pointed on, is referring to Gatorade by color, not by flavor, which they bear no resemblance to, at least the Zeros.
Exactly. I find for anything, like, white is a great color, blue is the second great color, and no matter what, you really can't go wrong with the flavor. It's like the flavor of blue, the flavor of white. It's good. Life is good. Life is good in blues and whites. So the one question I want to ask you about, of course, is the kind of, maybe in a sense, a step away a little bit more from the collection itself, is to kind of what you're working on right now. Because I know this is really a culmination, a lot of your efforts over the last several years. I hope that this is going to act as a springboard as well, to kind of give you the freedom and the confidence to write even more, because I think the genre and the community really needs these type of stories in it. Do you have any plans, or are you working on anything else in the pipeline that you want to share?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm always, cool. The last book that I put out, let's see if I can hold it up. This was Underworld Dreams. This was my third collection. It came out from Lev Press, and it is those are a collection of stories that are very much written with the intent to be an exploration between the psychological and the supernatural. So I'm always, I do have stories. I have a story that just came out in American Cannibal, edited by Rebecca Rowland, who is no stranger to your show. And I do have stories coming out in anthologies that not quite ready to announce yet, but you'll be the first to know when they do. But I do want to mention, as relates to the Night Marchers, I'm just about to turn in to my editor some of the characters and situations in the Night Marchers have found their way into a novel. That novel is called Servant of the Eighth Wind, and that's coming out from Lev Press. The short story Across the Darien Gap and Hurricane Sandrine, two stories from the book, it very much encompasses those two locations and some of the characters from there you'll find in there. So I'm hard at work at that, and when I'm busy cheating on the novel, I always have a story in one stage of development or another.
Oh, that's exciting.
We don't have an exact release date. I'm just getting the
Okay.
final edits in, but I'll be sure to share that information and share the scoop with you once everything's on its way and all set.
Cool. No, I really appreciate that. And that is super exciting. Yeah, the Hurricane of Sandrine, that was just a cool story. I really enjoyed that, and I think that that's really encapsulates, the importance to how well just having a setting as your focal point can make a difference to a story. So without
Yeah,
that setting, if it was just anywhere else, obviously it just wouldn't have worked. I mean, the setting itself was its own character.
yeah. It was about the setting. I'm glad you mentioned that because yeah, we get to go back to the island in that
Very cool.
story, and right there is something about the setting in Hurricane Sandrine, the short story, that is very um, important. Yeah, like as Rick said, it couldn't be anywhere else, and there is something different about that island that in the novel that really is the island as a character in itself. So I'm excited to be able to share that with everyone when it comes out.
Very cool. And not to put you on the spot, but to totally put you on the spot here, Dan.
Sure.
The now that story then now is it the novel that's coming out that you're working on then is that going to be kind of a continuation of what happens after the events of Hurricane Sandrine, or is it kind of a prequel to it, or is it its own story altogether?
It's its own. It doesn't. The plot doesn't relate to Hurricane Sandrine, but the plot of it, while it's not a prequel or a continuation, yeah, the plot is an expansion of what is going on in across the Darien Gap. We have the characters that you see in Across the Darien Gap are in there, and that's a good way to put it. That is, that's the center or the pearl in the oyster, or the expansion of that story, well, without being a straight prequel or continuation.
Okay, very cool, very cool. Yeah, and I'm always excited too to see, especially an author that has fantastic short stories. It's such a cool experience to be able to see, to be able to read something that's, you have an opportunity to really expand on a lot of, ideas and all in one big story. So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate
Yeah, it's
it.
going to be awesome.
Thank
So,
you.
question for you then. So, when you consider the fact that you like to cheat on your own work and you like to sneak in a few, a few stories in the back
Yeah.
door kind of thing, where's the best place for folks to find out what stories you have coming out into various anthologies, magazines, or what have you, so we can keep abreast and kind of keep a little bit satiated until your next book comes out.
Yeah, I have to cheat and look up my own website to tell you that right now. But yeah, you can find me on the social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I shouldn't be
Cool.
hard to find there. I also have a YouTube channel, which that one's easy. That's my name. That's Daniel Braum. You can find me on the Cemetery Dance website. I do write a column called Nighttime Logic, and you can connect with me there. And I believe my website is called Blood and Stardust on WordPress. And I shouldn't be too hard to find with just a search. Thanks for mentioning it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love an author who's easily stalkable. And to help everybody else kind of join forces as well in the whole stalker thing, I'll make sure I put links down below as well, so that everybody can
Thank you so much.
check it out in the description and click on and have at it kind of thing. So if I were to ask you, or folks that are kind of listening to this thinking, okay, great, you've got a bunch of these amazing stories, it sounds pretty interesting, I'm thinking about buying that, but what's the ultimate thing that you're really hoping that folks take away from your collection of stories, if there is any one focal point that you hope that people take away with them when they're done reading the final notes?
It's a really tempting. I'm tempted to give a dozen different answers, but I have to say, a story, at least for me, a story has to be fun and it has to entertain before it does anything else. I am a big proponent of stories doing all those everything else, but if the story isn't fun, if that story doesn't propel you along, at least for me, I don't care if it's changed me. I don't care if it does all the other things that literature and stories can do. The story has to be fun and it has to be entertaining. So the first thing is that if a reader is reading my stories, I hope it grabs them and I hope it entertains them, and then maybe we can get to one of those other things.
Perfect. Well, mission accomplished. Very entertaining stories all throughout. There wasn't a dead in the whole bunch, which is tough to pull off. Mileage always varies, as I have to say. But yeah, no, you're definitely going to get your your efficient. I'm trying to make a gas analogy, but just read the book. Every story.
You're going to get good gas mileage and bang for your buck with the Night Marchers. Coming to a gas station and bookstore near you.
What he said. Perfect. So one last question that I want to kind of leave off with is, when it comes to all the stories in this particular collection, however many there are, what was your particular favorite story, if there is one, maybe two? I'll give you a little bit of a buffer here, and why?
Wow, it's hard to say a favorite because they change every day. If I had to pick a calling card, if I had to say, hey, if you're going to try just one, I'll go with the first one. I'll go with Music of the Spheres because
interesting.
Because it is it does a lot of the things that we talked about. It might be the hallmark of a lot of the things that we're saying. It could be a psychological story. It could be a supernatural story. It is it is a story that doesn't quite fit in anywhere yet. It still is a story that I get good feedback that it has velocity, it keeps you going, and it entertains. So yeah, I really like that story. If I had to say, hey, you want to try one thing, try Music of the Spheres. If I had to say flip side, if I get two, I guess this week I'm thinking about the Moon and the Mesa. It's another unorthodox story. Yeah, it's a strange tale before I knew what a strange tale is. It is structurally unorthodox. It uses time in a very different way, but it's also very personal to the characters. There's a lot at stake for these characters, and it's a strange and fun story. So I'll have to go with that as my number one and number two for today.
Perfect. No, those are really good choices, and I mean, certainly the first one as well, I think, is great because I think it's interesting you mentioned it doesn't really fit anywhere, yet it has a tendency to speak, I think, to the masses. Certainly, I mean, it's got references of Bob Marley and the end of the world. So what's not to love about that one? And certainly when you're talking about the the final story that kind of leaves us, I feel, wanting more out of a collection, like, which is to say, I want more of the stories. It's so amazing because I found that you have that supernatural element in there, but it's almost interesting because when you kind of, at least for me anyways, and I'm thinking back to it, I'm like, well, you can take the supernatural element out of it and you still have a great story, but then you wonder, well, does that supernatural element, does it kind of distract from the natural elements of the story, or is maybe the natural elements of the story distracting from the supernatural aspects of it as well? And it's maybe the story is about trying to find a good balance between what we know and what we might not know about.
They're not lining up one to one. Like sometimes you could say, oh, it's an allegory for this, or oh, this means that. But one of the things that I like about strange fiction, and one of the things I like about my stories, is they don't quite line up neatly. And that adds to the tension. If I'm doing my job right, it adds to the tension. It adds to the feeling of unease. It adds to the feeling of wonder, where it's not quite one-to-one. Oh, the ghost is an allegory for grief. It's not
Sure.
quite a lineup like that. Before we go, I wanted to maybe backtrack to one of the other questions, is where you can catch up with me. I just realized on the Cemetery Dance website, if you scroll back a little bit from probably where you're seeing this, there is Across the Darien Gap is up there for free, so you can
Cool.
read the whole story, Across the Darien Gap, on the Cemetery Dance website for free. And The Moon and the Mesa is also available as a free audio I guess it's an audio podcast or an audio version up on the Pseudopod, like the jellyfish, the Pseudopod horror website.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, both Across the Darien Gap and The Moon and the Mesa were made into wonderful audio versions that I think they did a fantastic job.
Who's the narrator for those?
The Ben Phillips. Ben Phillips. I believe he did both of them. If I'm not mistaken, I know he did. I know he did one of them. I know he did The Moon and the Mesa. So it's slipping my mind right now if he did both of them, but I can email you those links. You can include them in the links, and
that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll do that as soon as we log off. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, and thank you very much as well, Dan. Really, really appreciate your time, and most importantly, thanks so much for your writing, your words, your collections, and I'm really looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for having me on your show. It's great spending time with you, and thank you for being a friend to authors and for spreading the word about fiction that you love. So thank you so much, Rick. I appreciate your time too.
My pleasure. Thank you.